Okay, so you want to own Uber, not drive for it, own it. The whole platform, 200 million people open your app every month. 40 million trips happen every single day. $193 billion moved through your system last year, and you don't own a single car in any of it. No fleet, no garages, no mechanics, no fuel bill, no parking lot. Somebody else buys the vehicle. Somebody else insures it, changes the oil, absorbs the depreciation, and sits in traffic. You own the software that decides who picks up whom, and you take a cut of every ride. It sounds like the perfect business. The lightest possible business. All the traffic, none of the metal. It is not simple. And the reason it isn't simple is the most expensive lesson in the history of Silicon Valley. Before you collect a single cut of a single fare, you have to understand what it cost to get to the point where the cut exists at all. From 2014 through 2022, Uber lost roughly $31.5 billion in operating losses, not revenue, losses. In 2019 alone, the year the company went public, it posted a net loss of about $8.5 billion. In 2020, another $6.7 billion. In 2022, over $9 billion. 14 years, never a profitable full year, not once. Read that again because it's the part everyone skips. The business model that looks so obvious in hindsight, take a cut and own nothing, did not work for more than a decade. And it didn't fail because the technology was bad. The app worked fine in 2016. The network was already dense by 2018. If network effects alone were what made this business profitable, it should have flipped somewhere around then. It didn't, because network effects were never the moat. The moat was money. Uber didn't win by having the best matching algorithm in the market. It won by being able to lose more money for longer than anyone else could survive losing it. Every competitor in every city had to answer one question: can you burn cash on driver bonuses and rider discounts for 10 straight years without dying? Almost nobody could. So here's the first thing nobody tells you about owning a platform. You're not buying software. You're buying the last position standing at the end of a war of attrition that costs $30 billion to win. And you can't buy that position. You'd have to fight for it again. Now, the good part, you survived. The competitors are gone or bought. Here's how the money actually works. The industry term for your cut is the take rate, and it's simple arithmetic. Revenue divided by gross bookings. Gross bookings is everything. The whole fare, tolls, taxes, fees, the driver's earnings, all of it. Revenue is what you keep. In 2025, Uber's gross bookings were $193 billion. Revenue was $52 billion. Divide one into the other, and you get roughly 27%. 27 cents of every dollar sitting in the middle of a $200 billion river of other people's transactions, doing none of the driving. And it finally works. In 2025, Uber produced $8.7 billion in adjusted EBITDA and $9.8 billion in free cash flow, and closed the year with a record $1.8 billion in operating income in a single quarter. That's the headline. That's what 27% looks like from the outside. Now look underneath it. Here's where it gets interesting. 27% is an average. It's an average across rides and delivery and freight, across 100 countries, across every fare type in the system. What it is not is the amount taken out of any particular trip. Until 2022, Uber worked essentially like a taxi meter with a commission bolted on top. There was a rate card, so much per mile, so much per minute. The rider paid the meter, the driver got a set percentage, Uber kept the rest. Everyone could do the arithmetic. Uber's own early promise to drivers was that they would keep no less than 75% of what the passenger paid. Then Uber introduced what it calls upfront pricing. Upfront pricing does exactly one thing, and it is the most important thing you will hear today. It decouples the two numbers. The price the rider pays is now set by one algorithm. The pay the driver receives is set by a different algorithm. They are calculated separately, and they are not tied to each other. There is no commission anymore. There's no percentage. There's a price, and there's a payment. And the gap between them is whatever the gap happens to be that day, on that trip, for that driver. The driver cannot see the rider's price in the app. Uber's rules bar drivers from asking the passenger directly. So, the person performing the service has no mechanical way to calculate the cut being taken out of the service they just performed. Researchers went looking anyway. A Columbia Business School study analyzed more than 24,000 trips from a single U.S. driver alongside 2 million trip requests and found the take rate on that driver's work climbed from around 32% before upfront pricing to roughly 42% by 2024. A separate longitudinal study out of Oxford tracking the same shift in London found the median cut rising from about 25 to 29%, with individual trips reaching as high as 50. Reporting has surfaced single rides where the cut hit 47. Uber's position is that those figures are not representative once averaged out over a week. Both things can be true at the same time. That's the entire point. The company reports 27%. The driver on a Tuesday afternoon on a 3-mile ride might be handing over 40. The average and the transaction are two different animals, and the platform is the only party in the arrangement that gets to see both. That's the trapdoor under the floor. Uber's most profitable product isn't the ride, it's the information asymmetry around the ride, and it shows up in the accounts. The same Columbia research estimated Uber's U.S. business became roughly $4 billion more profitable in 2024 than it had been in 2019. Over that same stretch, average weekly earnings for the typical Uber driver went from about $531 to $513. The river got bigger, the cut got bigger, the person standing in the water got slightly smaller. The take rate is the foundation. It is not the whole building. There are 3 more floors, and they're what separates a good platform from a great one. The first is advertising. Restaurants and brands pay to be shown to someone who is already holding the phone and already spending money. In 2025, this business crossed a $2 billion annual run rate, growing over 50% year over year. Notice the cost structure. The ad slot doesn't need a car, a driver, or a mile of road. It's revenue with almost nothing underneath it. The second is subscription. Uber One. Members pay a fixed fee for discounts and delivery perks. And what Uber actually buys with those discounts is frequency. Consumers who use both rides and delivery generate 3 times the bookings of single product users. The subscription isn't really a revenue line, it's a lock. The third is category expansion. Delivery crossed a $100 billion annual run rate. Same drivers, same map, same algorithm, different cargo. Freight. The one segment that doesn't work like this declined 1% in 2025 in a punishing market. That's the pattern. Once you own the matching layer, every new category you bolt onto it costs almost nothing to add because the expensive part, the network of people willing to show up, has already been paid for by somebody else. So where does the money actually go? The largest line item is the one you'd never guess from the outside. Insurance. In the United States, Uber carries commercial liability on rides it doesn't drive, in vehicles it doesn't own, with people it doesn't employ. It's the single biggest cost of revenue in the rides business, and it climbs with every claim, every verdict, every state that rewrites its rules. Then payment processing. A small percentage of every single transaction, at billions of transactions a year, paid straight to the card networks. Then driver incentives. This one is interesting because it isn't fixed. It's a dial. When supply gets thin in a city, Uber spends to pull drivers back onto the road. When supply is abundant, the dial turns down. It's a cost that behaves like a weapon. Then legal and regulatory. Which brings us to the thing the entire structure is sitting on. Everything you've just heard. The ownership of nothing, the 27%, the $4 billion in extra margin rests on a single legal classification. The drivers are independent contractors, not employees. If that changes, the model doesn't get worse. It becomes a different business. Employees mean minimum wage floors, payroll taxes, benefits, holiday pay, vehicle costs migrating onto your balance sheet. The asset-light platform suddenly holding the exact asset it spent 15 years avoiding. This has already been tested. In 2021, the UK Supreme Court ruled that Uber drivers there are workers entitled to minimum wage and holiday pay. In California, Proposition 22 carved out a middle category after a ballot campaign funded by the platforms at a scale that state had never seen. Legislators in Chicago and Connecticut have introduced bills that skip the classification argument entirely and simply cap the take rate by law, guaranteeing drivers 80 or 85% of the fare. Keep this in mind if you ever think a profitable platform is a safe platform. The mall owner's risk is that the anchor tenant leaves. The platform owner's risk is that a legislature redefines what the tenants are. And then there's the ending that Uber itself isn't pretending won't arrive. Here is the CEO's own framing on the 2025 results. The company enters 2026 with a clear path to becoming the largest facilitator of autonomous vehicle trips in the world. Facilitator, not owner. Think about what that word does to the economics. Uber's largest cost is the driver. Autonomy deletes the driver. On paper, that's the greatest margin expansion in corporate history, right up until you ask the second question. If the car drives itself and the car belongs to somebody else's fleet, what exactly is the middleman selling? The answer Uber is betting on is demand. 200 million people who already have the app already have a card on file, already open it out of pure habit. The fleet owner has a car with no passengers. Uber has passengers with no car. That's still a market, and markets still pay a toll. But notice the shift. For 15 years, the scarce thing was drivers, and Uber spent $30 billion to be the one who had them. In an autonomous world, the scarce thing is capital and hardware. And the people who own capital and hardware are not a loose crowd of individuals with no bargaining power. They're a handful of the largest companies on Earth, negotiating one contract at a time. You can take 42% from a driver who isn't allowed to see the number. You cannot take 42% from a counterparty with a legal department. So does owning Uber actually work as a business? The honest answer depends entirely on which decade you're standing in, and the gap between the two outcomes is enormous. In the optimistic scenario, you own the demand layer for physical movement on Earth. Bookings compound above 20% a year, the way they have for 5 consecutive years. Advertising and subscription revenue grow faster than the rides underneath them, so margin expands even in flat quarters. Autonomy arrives gradually, on your platform, on your terms, and your biggest cost line quietly evaporates while your cut holds steady. In the realistic bad year, one large market reclassifies your drivers, and every other regulator on Earth sits back and watches what happens next. A take rate cap passes in 2 states and becomes the template for 20 more. The fleet operators in autonomy work out that they can build their own app because the app was never the hard part, and your 27% turns from a setting into a negotiation. Both versions run on identical code. The difference isn't technology, it's who has leverage. A shopping mall owner rents you a room. A gold mine owner sells you metal. A rancher sells you protein. Uber sells you nothing at all. There is no product here. There is a decision. Who gets this ride? At what price? For what pay? Made $193 billion a year in a fraction of a second by software that exactly one party in the transaction is permitted to read. Uber doesn't own the cars. Uber owns the gap. And the gap was always worth more than the fleet.